Thank you, Steve, and I consider it a great honour to be allowed to address this very august meeting of AAAA, which, if you hadn't heard about it, is the Australian Aviation Addicts Anonymous. I do have a complaint about aviation, and that is when I started to learn to fly, nobody pointed out to me how dangerously addictive aviation is. And that's proof of everybody here today. We're all addicted to it, come hell or high water. That was when I started to fly, but I think my addiction started way back in 1947 at the age of 7, flying off the West Australian coast, the West African coast, slip of the tongue, West African coast in a Dakota. I was a passenger in the back, and then in those giddy days, I was allowed to go up into the cockpit and look out of the cockpit at the panorama below, and I think that's when the addiction started. Just to explain what this hiccup-liter is about, hiccup-liter is because my young daughter could never get her mouth around helicopter, so hiccup-liter it was, and hiccup-liter it stayed for life. Driver is because when we were young guns trying to learn to fly helicopters, we thought we were the bee's knees until our instructors pointed out that they could quite easily teach monkeys to fly helicopters. What they couldn't do was teach them to operate in an emergency situation. So they told us to pin our ears back and listen, and it was good advice. There are many, many definitions of helicopters and choppers, and this is one of them. Thousands of parts flying in close formation around an oil leak waiting for metal fatigue to set in. And I know you plank wing pilots will appreciate that. I must qualify my talk because I have to admit that the older I get, the better I used to fly. Now, some plank wing pilots I know consider choppers to be nasty, noisy little things, and your attitude is probably reflected in this slide here. Now, I don't want to bore the pants off you as I easily could, giving you all the boring details of my non-illustrious career. So, bearing in mind that bad news sells newspapers, I will try and focus on the things that didn't quite go to plan, because they're more interesting. In 1959, I joined the Royal Marine Commandos in UK, and after a while it occurred to me that there were easier ways of going to war than on my flat feet. The Navy, the Fleet Air Arm, then put out the word they were looking for volunteers to fly helicopters, and my arm shot up for the first time and only time in the military. I had to wait a little while to do the course, and so while I was waiting, I got to the local aero club and put in a few hours on the Tiger Moth. A beautiful machine of which I have great affection and adoration, and I don't want to tread on anybody's toes when my view of the beautiful Tiger Moth is that really it's a box kite with an engine strapped to the front. Moved on from there to the de Havilland Chipmunk, which is a rugged, luckily, simple aircraft, aerobatic capable, but its limitation was that it didn't have an inverted carburetor. So if you turned upside down, all was fine, and if you lingered too long, the engine quit and you were into a forced landing, which is strange for an aerobatic plane. One time I was up doing solo aerobatics, and to my concern I found loose objects flying around the cockpit. Having been briefed that they're anathema in aviation and they could jam the controls, I had a quandary. What do I do about this? I couldn't reach down to the floor because of the harness, the parachute, the straps, the joystick, etc. So I had to invert the aeroplane, pick the pieces off the top of the cockpit, which was now the bottom, and then roll upright again before the engine quit. Store those pieces away in a pocket. Then there was still some down there, so roll inverted again, pick the pieces up off the cockpit and roll out straight, and I then crept back to base very, very carefully. Subsequently, it transpired, if anybody's familiar with the Chipmunk, there's a front and back seat cockpit, and the rear throttle quadrant had come adrift. Somebody had forgotten to put in a split pin, and so the knurled nut and the washers and everything else was what was flying around the cockpit. We then converted to helicopters. This is the Hiller 12E, interestingly enough in Australian registration. And we discovered that trying to fly a helicopter was like, initially anyway, like trying to balance when you're standing on a ball. It's all over the place. But sooner or later we got the hang of that and graduated on to the next step, which was the Westland Whirlwind, which was a clunky old machine, 4 wheels as you can see, with an old piston engine under the bonnet. Tended to be a bit underpowered, and a couple of instances with this one. A couple of the students in the course were doing simulated instrument flying under the hood, where the right-hand student is wearing orange goggles, and we put blue perspex on all the windows. So all he can see is inside the cockpit, whilst the student instructor on the left seat can see the outside. So off they went off the coast of Cornwall to do instrument flying and unusual attitude recovery. And in this case, the student instructor would put the aircraft into an unusual attitude and then tell the student pilot to recover it on instruments. It must have been a very unusual attitude because then the student pilot grabbed the control, hauled back on the stick, the rotors chopped the tail off. Now, you can fly a chopper without a tail rotor, but not in upward flight. You can in auto rotation. So they correctly entered auto rotation, picked a nice spot on a soft beach, came on down beautifully, flared, and forgot with no tail rotor. They raised the lever and started to spin. The aircraft then went on its left-hand side, or its port side. And the story goes that the student instructor who was on the left side scrambled, undid his straps, scrambled across the console, over across the student pilot in the right-hand seat, out of the window and up into the sand dunes waiting for the explosion before the student in the right-hand seat had even undone his belt. Such are the traumas. Okay, and, oh, sorry. Back. Another thing with the Whirlwind, it was rather underpowered. So you had myself in the right-hand seat, an instructor in the left-hand seat, a winchman in the rear, in the back there, and we would go and put some poor unsuspecting survivor, drop him off in the ocean, and then our job was to come around and pick him back up. A helicopter stays in the air due to two things: engine power and rotor revs. If the rotor revs die down, you're going to fall out of the sky because the blades will cone and lose lift. But you need engine power to keep those rotors at the right revs. And when you're underpowered and you're heavy and you're trying to pull somebody out of the water, there's an interesting exercise of milking that throttle and keeping the rotor revs up. If the rotor revs die, the only way to get them back if you're at full throttle is to lower the lever and go towards the sea. So then you milk it and try and get the engine back up and get back to normal. From there, progressed on to the Westland Wessex, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Onwards to beautiful Bell 47, the MASH machine, or sometimes referred to as the Meccano-tailed helicopter. This one is up in the Kimberleys. Next was the Bell Jet Ranger, very much a saloon type thing to fly. I never really liked twin rotors, I prefer four. Not that you've got redundancy anyway, but it just flies better. Yeah, not a bad aircraft, but the early ones were very underpowered, and there used to be a few engine failures because the engine, in those days, the early engines were running at 100% capacity most of the time, and that's not good for any mechanics. By the time I got onto them, they'd got a better engine, which was good, because I wanted to get home to the pub every night. And this beautiful, beautiful machine was the Hughes 500C and its subsequent 500D. Absolutely four-bladed, short blades, very, very manoeuvrable. the Yanks irreverently referred to it as the bionic blowfly. But it is the sports car of helicopters, just a beautiful machine. Okay, back to the Westland Wessex. This basically was a British Tommy variant on the Sikorsky HH-34. The problem with that original aircraft was, again, it had a piston engine under the bonnet, and in hot conditions or altitude, it was low on power. So initially the Poms put a single jet engine under the front, I think it was a Gazelle, and that worked all right, but they then decided, well, let's see if we can get twin engine under there. And they put in 2 Rolls-Royce Gnomes, and they were brilliant. They worked through a coupling gearbox up to the rotor. I maintain that the time it launched, it was a world-beating aircraft. It had amazing power and great capacity. It could take 16 troops in the bag. It also was very versatile. It could take underslung loads. Let's see, play with that. That winch there allows you to lift underslung loads. You could also rescue people with the winch, which was up there. That's the starboard engine. What else is there to show? This nose was put on because of dust and debris. It was basically an air filter, because jet engines don't like FOD or foreign object damage. We graduated from training onto the operational squadron, night flying, instrument flying, underslung loads, winching, restricted area operations into clearings, low flying, oh, that was a ball, formation flying, deck landings, abseiling troops, mountain flying, and weapons. You had to have a fair bit of flexibility. That's the joystick which I'll pass around. You had multiple controls. You had press to transmit, press to talk to your crew in the back, autopilot trim, left and right, up and down, and then you had cargo drop, so that when you got your cargo in position, you dropped it. On the other side, you had a guillotine cut to cut the cable. If your cable got snagged in the mast of a ship you were trying to rescue, rather than that pull you down, you could jettison your cable. You also had autopilot release, trim release, autopilot release, and what isn't showing on this one, you also had your weapons firing one. So I'll pass that round if you want to get your hands on a joystick. The idea that the squadron was formed, and then we got up to operational workup standard before we embarked on the aircraft carrier. We were based down in Cornwall, if anybody knows, UK, down the bottom left-hand corner, and we were on the south coast of that, near Helston. And on one occasion we were due to go and work with the army up in Wales, but the weather was very, very claggy, the cloud was on the hilltops, and we didn't want to disappoint the army, so we slid off our base down to sea level, below the cliffs, flew southwest opposite to the direction we wanted to go, so it was the only one we could go, went around the end of Land's End, then headed northeast, back up the Severn Channel, and by that time, an hour or so later, the clag had lifted and we were able to get on with the job. I hesitate to say this, but if it had been an Air Force squadron, we'd have stayed on the ground and stayed at the bar. The part of the workup was, one of our jobs was we went to Biggin Hill for a Battle of Britain air display, and this is, I had a Flight magazine photographer on board, and this is the shot from the cockpit, and you can see all the other aircraft there with troops on board about to go and do the demonstration. Fair number of instruments down there, helmet, throat mic, gloves, standard procedure. Interesting, many years later I went back to UK on a holiday, went to the Fleet Aero Museum in Yeovilton. Has anybody been there?
Yep.
Yeah. Wonderful, yeah, wonderful place. And afterwards I just happened to be moseying through the shop, not much interested until I spied something, and I couldn't believe my eyes, because this die-cast model was the exact replica with the side numbers, C for Charlie, squadron designation, B for Bullock on the back, of that aircraft I flew there. So, of course, what could I do? I had to buy it. I will pass it round. It is, although it's die-cast, there are fragile parts. So we've all worked up, the squadron was ready to go, and we embarked on the HMS Bulwark, which you see here, irreverently known as the Rusty Bee, because she was an old fixed-wing carrier that was no longer fit. If you tried to land a jet on that deck, the jet would have gone through the deck, it was so rusty. So they said, well, in that case, we'll turn it into a commando carrier, helicopter carrier. So here you can see field guns at the front, lots of Wessex there, trucks there, Bell 47s there, and more trucks there. Lots of lovely sailors, all dressed in their whites, on the side of the ship there, as I think we were coming into Aden at that point. The squadron embarked from the base. We embarked straight onto the aircraft carrier in the English Channel. And we then sailed through the Mediterranean, the Suez Canal, Middle East, to Singapore, Malaya, Borneo waters, Hong Kong, and Brisbane. And that's where I said I've got to end up in Australia. On the way we were doing carrier deck landings, many of course, some in smooth water, some in more interesting water, some at day, some at night. Landing on a deck is you want to judge it so that as the ship rises to its apogee, that's when you want to touch the deck. Because if it's coming up and you're going down, it's not a very good look. It's also interesting when it's rolling as well, but pitch was the worst thing, bringing it up and down. I think this one is what radio call would be short finals, alpha short finals for spot 6, because there were numbered spots on the deck. Yeah, this is demonstrating load lifting off the helicopter, off the carrier deck. This is lifting a 105 pack howitzer that the artillery used. Now what you can see there, those things are gas canisters, which if you hit the salt water in ditching, they would blow like great airbags both sides of the main wheels, and there was an already inflated airbag in the tail. So you hoped that that would keep you afloat. It sometimes did happen that one would inflate and the other wouldn't, and you'd end up upside down, which wasn't really desirable. This was the early Wessex with a single gas turbine engine. You see the exhaust there, lifting a stripped down Land Rover. This is just another heavy lift job up to an inaccessible point. Now, we were off Malaysia, we were sailing in the China Sea. We'd probably been in trouble with certain people up there these days, but we were in the China Sea. And we got the call that there were bad floods on the east coast of Malaya in a place called Terengganu. So we sailed down there and were involved in flood relief. So rather than military operations, we were flying in bags of rice to isolated communities. Now, what's interesting about this one is you can see there, that's the weapons platform, and on that you could have machine guns, rockets, or in those bad old days, the wire-guided SS-11 missile. But you had to take off the airbags because if they inflated, they'd have punctured against that. So that was just tough luck if you ditched under those circumstances. Many, many times I was very happy to have 2 engines under the bonnet, and particularly in this case, because flying over that sort of jungle, if you had to auto rotate, your chances of a successful engine off landing were nil. You just go into the treetops and fall down the rest.
Did it fly all right on one?
Yes, yeah, this was another thing I liked about this chopper, because you could get home on one. If you're full load, you couldn't take off with one. But if one failed when you were flying forward with a translational lift, it would get you home safely even at full load. So it was great. This is a typical clearing in Borneo, where the Gurkhas would be dropped in by abseil, and then their job would be to cut a bigger clearing so the bigger choppers could actually land in and pick up troops or drop off supplies, whatever was needed. One of the challenging exercises we were trying to do when we were based at the ship Bulwark was based in Singapore. They decided, let's try and do night formation tactical flying, and this was in the days way beyond, before we had night vision goggles. So one was relying on silhouette and eating plenty of carrots and that sort of thing. And This worked okay when you had the lights of Singapore as a background, because you could see the silhouette of the aircraft you were flying on. Because of course they said no lights, you couldn't have your navigation lights or anything else on. But once you lost that silhouette and into the pitch blackness, it was very shaky stuff. So we did the experiment, we tried it, we all decided, the hell with that, let's get to the bar, and we never did it again. From my time in the Navy, for my sins, I'm not sure what I did wrong, I went on exchange with the Royal Air Force, which was fun. And from there, we were based at RAF Odium in UK. This is Fleet Air Arm 5 aircraft formation. Yeah, we went to Libya, and there you can see the problems. That aircraft had just come into land, and all that dust is what would not mix well with the jet engine. So there were challenges there. Huge dust storm. On another occasion, one of the teeny-weeny airways, sorry, let me explain, that's the Army Air Corps, Bell 47s had a problem, so we had to go and rescue it. So I said, we're a versatile aircraft, we can be the RAC of the air there too. We also went on exercise to Denmark, in Europe it is, and we were in sections, loose formation, and we were flying over up towards the Ruhr, and the Ruhr had lots and lots of chimneys belching out lots and lots of smoke, which mixed with all the atmosphere meant that inadvertently we entered cloud. Now the section leader had been a fighter pilot recently converted to helicopters, and he wasn't worried in the slightest, because in fixed wing jet, if you enter a cloud, number 2 just puts his cockpit right on the tip, wing tip, and follows him through. But with helicopters, you've got counter-rotating rotors, which you don't want to get entangled. So the brief was, brake away from the leader, 30 degrees left and 30 degrees right. That was okay, and then for a couple of minutes, and then resume the original track. But it would have been nice to have been able to use the radio. The radio frequency we were on was an American one, and the Yanks just chatter, 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 whole time, like they were talking to their wife on the telephone. We couldn't get a word in edgeways. I was getting, it was the most frightened I've ever been. I don't like clouds with solid objects in the middle of them. But suffice to say, luckily, we came out of it okay, broke out into the clear, and went on to our destination. We landed in Denmark, set up in the camp, was in the field, and one of my tasks there was to take media people, the dreaded press, forward to the front, so-called battle line. So we embarked them, went forward, nice landing, grass landing field. Coming in, I thought I'd better make this smooth because we don't want the bad press with bumpy landing. So just touched the tail wheel on, touched the starboard wheel on, went to touch the port wheel on, nothing. I thought, that's strange, I did not see a hole there. I couldn't see any reason not to be able to touch. So I just moved the chopper forward a bit on its tail wheel and starboard wheel and tried again. Still, the aircraft was lurching, couldn't touch ground. From my position in the starboard seat, I couldn't see the left wheel, port wheel, or any of the gear there at all. So I said to my crewman over the intercom, mate, can you nip round and have a look at what's going on the port side there? I can't seem to touch down. So he said, yeah, okay. So out he went. I saw him disappear around the nose. I was sort of following him, waiting. The next thing I saw, he came back carrying the port wheel. Which, oh well, that's interesting. What the press thought when he put the port wheel in there, I don't know. But anyway, we decided we'd disembark the press and then call base. So it was Houston, we have a problem. Because there was no way you could shut that chopper down with no left-hand undercoach. So just go over on a port side, rotors at high speed would contact the ground, be flying metal everywhere. So okay, we talked to base. Base said, right, first thing you need to do is go and fill up with fuel. Bearing in mind the Air Force do not like hot refueling or rotors running refuel. was that they had no option in this case. So we got pressure refueled up to full tanks, and then said to base, well, what now? So they said, come back to base, and we made a mound of tents, folded tents, and try and put your port side on them. I didn't really like this idea because they're sort of soft and they can compress and that sort of thing. But as soon as we tried the first initial bit, it was obvious it was just going to buckle the skin of the aircraft, and it was no good at all. So we took off and went out of the way, and then they said, we have tripod jacks, we'll try them. But where that oleo leg joins the fuselage, there's a little stud the size of a 10-cent piece. And that's where the jack goes when they're doing maintenance and this sort of thing. So they set up the jack, which has a cup in it, again the size of a 10-cent piece, braced it all with the tents, and so they said, but you got simple, just put the stud in the cup. Yeah, no worries. So we got close, touched down. My crewman went and got a long intercom lead so that he could talk to me, he could see what was going on, and he could talk to me and tell me what to do and con me in. So that's what he did. Forward, right a bit, forward, left a bit, etc. It was made a little more difficult because as the aircraft had to settle, it would go to the left, to the port side of it. So he had to judge from there to there what was the right place. Suffice to say, he did a wonderful job and conned me in, and the stud dropped into the cup. Okay, so far. Now we've got to shut down. And anybody who knows helicopters, if you've ever heard of ground resonance, this is where they can get an oscillation like this and shake themselves to bits. If that starts to happen, normally you'd wind up your rotors and take off and come back and try again. That option wasn't really possible here, so it was a question of slowing down the rotors very carefully, but making sure the crewmen and everybody else went and hid in the woods while this process was going on, because if it slipped off the jack, it would be in a bit of a tangled mess and a lot of report writing to be done, which we didn't want to do. We had shut down the rotors and all was well. One of the benefits of my time with the Air Force was that they didn't fly an awful lot. And whilst that wasn't good for my total flying hours, it meant that I could go off to a little corner and complete my correspondence course, and I duly qualified with my UK airline transport pilot license helicopters, which is great because that set me up to come to Australia and get employment here, for which I'm forever thankful. Sorry, this is a shot of a tactical formation going into Salisbury Plain, and this was sort of down low and close. And this was the offending article here. Just in case you thought I did a heavy landing, let me prove that I was very happy to get later on the metallurgical analysis, which showed that the axle had, over the progress of time, the crack had been slowly opening until the final one, just happened to be me, touched it and she snapped. All right, now you must remember helicopter pilots don't fly, we just beat the air into submission. So thank you all very much for your patience.